Across the shattered landscape of war-torn Europe, church bells tolled with a mournful resonance, their chimes echoing through devastated villages and cities. Guns fired salvos into the vast, open sky, a chaotic symphony of victory and relief, while colorful flags fluttered proudly, proclaiming a hard-won freedom. For millions of weary souls, this marked the long-awaited end of 6 grueling years of relentless conflict, a moment of collective exhale after years of fear and loss. But for a particular group of young women huddled in the shadowy, soot-stained corners of Germany's desolate train stations, this day carried a starkly different meaning, heavy with uncertainty and dread. Their uniforms, once symbols of duty, were now tattered, threadbare remnants of the ridiculed auxiliaries, mocked helpers of a regime that had crumbled. Their boots, cracked and worn from endless marches, barely clung to their feet, and their hair, matted and filthy after weeks of desperate retreat through a collapsing nation, hung limply over their faces. Some were barely 20 years old, their youthful features still faintly visible beneath layers of grime, exhaustion, and the weight of a war that had aged them far beyond their years. These women, secretaries, typists, radio operators, nurses, had been small but essential cogs in a vast military machine that had consumed their country, only to collapse in their trembling hands, leaving them stranded in the wreckage of defeat. Now, with Germany broken into fragments of its former self, these women were herded onto trains, not for a joyful homecoming to loved ones, but for an uncertain journey into captivity. The scene was strange and haunting. Lines of women in faded gray-green skirts and jackets, their shoulders slumped, dragging battered suitcases that held the last fragments of their lives. They stepped cautiously into dark, creaking wooden boxcars, once used to ferry soldiers to the blood-soaked fronts of battle, now repurposed to carry these defeated women to an unknown fate. Some clutched rosaries, their fingers tracing the beads in silent prayer for protection or mercy. Others gripped dented tins of rationed food, their only safeguard against starvation. Some held nothing at all, their hands empty, their spirits hollowed by loss. A young girl from Hamburg, her voice barely above a whisper, leaned toward her companion and murmured, "The Americans won't be kind. They'll punish us harshly." Her words carried the weight of fear, seeded by a Luftwaffe officer's grim warnings during the chaotic days of surrender, when hope seemed as distant as the stars. Another woman, hardened by years of operating anti-aircraft searchlights under the deafening roar of enemy bombers, said nothing. Her jaw was set, her eyes steely, as if bracing herself for an inevitable blow. They had been told repeatedly, in propaganda-soaked whispers and shouted decrees, that the Allies, especially the Americans, were not men but wolves, predators who would subject them to shame, cruelty, or fates far worse in the confines of captivity. The trains rumbled westward, their wheels grinding against the tracks, cutting through a desolate landscape scarred by war's unrelenting hand. Burned-out towns drifted past the windows like ghostly apparitions, their skeletal remains a testament to destruction. Churches stood topless, their steeples shattered or gone. Bridges lay crumpled into muddy rivers, and factories, reduced to twisted metal and ash, smoldered faintly with lingering smoke. Children, gaunt and hollow-eyed, waved from grassy embankments, their faces as thin as paper, their gestures a mix of curiosity and desperation. At night, when the trains halted in the eerie stillness, the women pressed close to one another for warmth, their bodies shivering in the damp, unheated cars. Outside, the heavy tread of guards' boots crunched against gravel, a constant reminder of their captivity, punctuated now and then by the distant crack of gunfire echoing through the darkness. One woman, Anna, a former secretary from Munich who had once typed orders in a bustling office, now clung to a small, tattered diary she had managed to keep hidden. In its pages, she poured out her fears in faint, hurried script. "We are going far, to some unknown place. No one knows where we're headed. My mother will think I'm dead. Perhaps I will be." Her words, scratched in the dim light of a swaying train car, captured the suffocating uncertainty that gripped them all. The grueling journey did not end in a German prison camp, as some had feared, but at bustling, chaotic ports like Bremen, Le Havre, and Cherbourg, where American ships waited under the bold stars and stripes of their flags. The women were marched toward the docks, their steps faltering as they passed rows of soldiers whose faces they couldn't decipher. Some looked curious, their eyes scanning the women with interest, while others appeared indifferent, their gazes sliding past without acknowledgement. The women braced themselves for yells, insults, or even physical blows, the punishments they had been conditioned to expect. Instead, they encountered an almost bewildering order: paperwork, lines, and a methodical efficiency that felt more like a bureaucratic process than the vengeance they had dreaded. They were counted, tagged with identification numbers, and divided into groups, the process so orderly it seemed strangely impersonal. Yet, as the ship's engines roared to life, their deep hum vibrating through the decks, and the coastline of Europe shrank into a distant blur, a heavy dread settled into their bones. The Atlantic Ocean stretched before them, vast, endless, and unyielding, a watery abyss separating them from all they had known. America, a mysterious and far-off land painted in their minds as a realm of enemy propaganda and fearsome caricatures, awaited on the other side, its reality shrouded in uncertainty. On board the ships, seasickness gripped many, their stomachs churning with the relentless rocking of the waves. The bunks were cramped, stacked tightly in cold, steel holds where the air was thick with the sharp tang of salt and diesel fuel. Food was distributed on metal trays: pale, soft white bread, thick slices of meat, and steaming mugs of coffee, a stark contrast to the meager rations they had known for years. The women stared in disbelief at the bounty before them. For years, they had survived on cabbage stalks, ersatz bread made from sawdust and barley, and watery soup ladled from rusted cans, each bite a reminder of scarcity. Some hesitated, their hands trembling as they held the trays, suspecting poison or some cruel trick. Others devoured the food with desperate hunger, tears streaming down their faces as the taste of real, fresh bread overwhelmed their senses. "They feed us like they feed themselves," one woman whispered, her voice thick with astonishment, her mind struggling to reconcile this act with the punishment they had been taught to expect. They had braced for cruelty, for degradation, not this unexpected provision. The reality of it unsettled them far more than any brutality might have, planting seeds of doubt in the narratives they had clung to. When the ships finally docked on American shores, New York's towering skyline, Boston's historic charm, New Orleans' vibrant energy, the women gathered on deck, their hands gripping the rails as they gazed at cities untouched by the bombs that had ravaged their homeland. The Statue of Liberty loomed in the distance, its torch a silent irony that drew no smiles from their lips. Crowds lined the piers, some jeering with hostility, others watching with quiet curiosity, their faces a mix of emotions the women couldn't fully interpret. The prisoners marched ashore under guard, their worn boots echoing loudly on the wooden planks of the docks. The air smelled different here, clean, free, infused with the salt of the ocean but untainted by the acrid ash of war that had clung to everything in Europe. For the first time, the full weight of their nation's collapse hit them. Germany was a land of rubble, its cities reduced to debris and despair. America, by contrast, stood whole, prosperous, and vibrantly alive, its streets bustling with a vitality that felt almost otherworldly to the women who had known only destruction. Buses and trains carried them inland to camps scattered across the United States: Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia's rolling hills, Camp Ruston in Louisiana's humid plains, and dozens of others. The roads unfurled before them, flanked by endless green fields where crops swayed in the breeze, and small towns where children rode bicycles down quiet streets and houses gleamed with pristine white porches. To women who had watched their own cities burn under the relentless fire of Allied bombs, the sight was almost incomprehensible, a vision of a world untouched by the horrors they had endured. They whispered among themselves in hushed, incredulous tones, "Is this really the land of monsters? Can this abundance, this peace, be real?" Germany had promised them victory, a glorious empire, and delivered only ruins and starvation. The enemy they had been taught to despise, to fear as inhuman, seemed to inhabit an entirely different universe, one of plenty and possibility that challenged everything they had been told. At the gates of the camps, their names were meticulously recorded, their meager possessions catalogued, and their tattered uniforms exchanged for plain, functional work clothes. But before they could settle into their new reality, the guards, firm but not cruel, directed them toward a low, unassuming building. Inside, steam hissed through pipes, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly. It was a delousing station, though the women didn't yet know it, and their hearts pounded with fear. This, they thought, could be the moment of humiliation, the cruelty they had been warned about, the punishment they had steeled themselves for. Whispers rippled through the long line. "This is where they'll make us suffer." One woman clutched her suitcase as if it could shield her from harm, while another crossed herself in silent prayer, her lips moving soundlessly. The line inched forward, each step heavy with anticipation, until they entered a tiled room where their fears collided with an unexpected reality. They were handed bars of soap, real soap, thick, white, heavy in their hands, carrying the faint, unfamiliar scent of flowers. Clean towels followed, then fresh garments, simple but soft. The showers released streams of hot water, a luxury they hadn't known in years, washing away months of grime, sweat, and despair. Some women wept openly, their sobs echoing off the tiles, raw and unguarded. Others laughed nervously, their voices trembling with disbelief, unable to process the sensation of cleanliness, of hair free from lice, of skin unburdened by dirt. This was not the humiliation they had feared. It was restoration, a reclaiming of dignity that shook them to their very core. Anna, alone with her thoughts that night, opened her diary, her handwriting trembling across the page. "We were told we'd be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, they gave us soap. How is this possible?" She couldn't yet grasp that this simple act of washing, this moment of unexpected care, would etch itself into her memory more deeply than the war itself. The women lay in their bunks, their hair still damp from the showers, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of starch and clean cotton, a far cry from the threadbare scraps they had known in Germany. Outside, the American night hummed with the gentle chirping of crickets, a peaceful contrast to the thunder of guns that had defined their lives for so long. They whispered to one another, their voices low but urgent, as if sharing a fragile secret too precious to be spoken aloud. "Perhaps the enemy isn't what we were told. Perhaps there's something here that propaganda and fear can't explain." What lay ahead, meals, work, interactions with Americans, promised to astonish them further, to challenge their beliefs in ways they couldn't yet imagine. For now, one image lingered in every mind, the soap in their hands, slippery, fragrant, absurdly gentle, a symbol of a kindness they hadn't dared to expect. It was only the beginning of their captivity, yet it already felt like the dawn of something entirely new, something that defied the narratives of hate and fear they had carried for so long. As dawn broke over the camp, casting a soft golden light across the barbed wire, a question settled among them like a quiet morning mist, heavy with possibility. If the enemy could show such unexpected humanity, what other surprises lay ahead? The buses rolled through gates crowned with coils of barbed wire, their engines grumbling as clouds of pale dust rose from the dry camp roads. To the women inside, the sight was both frightening and strangely orderly, a paradox that mirrored their own conflicted hearts. Guard towers stood at regular intervals, their silhouettes stark against the sky, yet the soldiers within lounged casually, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, their postures more relaxed than menacing. Rows of barracks stretched neatly across the fields, their wooden walls painted in soft, neutral tones, the paths between them swept clean, the fences intact but somehow less threatening than the women had imagined. This was not the gray, brutal nightmare of a concentration camp they had feared. It was something bewilderingly different, a place that seemed to operate under a different set of rules. The prisoners exchanged silent glances, their eyes asking the same unspoken question. What world have we stepped into? When they disembarked from the buses, each woman was handed a numbered tag, a small but tangible marker of their new status as prisoners. American officers moved with clipped efficiency, scribbling notes on clipboards and stamping documents with a rhythm that felt almost mechanical. The women stiffened, bracing themselves for insults, harsh commands, or worse. Yet the guards spoke with a calm authority, their voices softened by the drawls of the South or the flat, steady tones of the Midwest, accents unfamiliar but strangely soothing. For many, the first shock was not cruelty, but this unexpected calmness, this absence of malice. The Americans treated them neither as monsters to be reviled nor as guests to be welcomed, but as something strangely ordinary, prisoners of war to be managed, catalogued, and housed with a professionalism that felt almost surreal. The delousing station had already unsettled them with its unexpected civility, But what followed was even stranger, a continuation of a reality that defied their every expectation. After the showers, the women were led to a cavernous mess hall, its long room filled with the warm, intoxicating aroma of coffee, freshly baked bread, and something sizzling in grease. They froze in the doorway, disoriented by the sheer richness of the smells alone, their senses overwhelmed by a bounty they had long forgotten. Tables stretched across the hall, laden with trays of food, steaming boiled potatoes, bright orange carrots, hearty beef stew with chunks of meat glistening in rich broth, and soft rolls gleaming with a sheen of butter. Steam fogged the windows, curling in wisps that seemed to carry the promise of plenty. The aroma was thick, almost tangible, an assault of abundance that left them reeling. A guard motioned them forward with a casual wave, and reluctantly, they stepped to the counter. A cook, his white apron stained with grease, scooped generous portions of stew onto tin plates, slid thick slices of bread across, and filled mugs with hot, fragrant coffee. The women accepted the trays as though handling something fragile, something explosive, their hands unsteady with disbelief. Some couldn't meet the cook's eyes, their gazes fixed on the floor, while others stared at the food, questioning its reality. In Germany, the final winter of the war had reduced meals to black bread mixed with sawdust, watery turnip soup, and, if they were lucky, a scrap of horse meat. Now, in the heart of the enemy's camp, they were given more in a single meal than they had seen in weeks, a feast that felt like a dream or a trap. Anna, her diary tucked safely beneath her mattress, sat at a long wooden table, her tray before her. She dipped her spoon into the stew, watching the grease shimmer on its surface, the chunks of meat catching the light. Tentatively, she brought the spoon to her lips, tasting it. Her eyes widened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as if ashamed of the pleasure the flavor brought her. Around her, other women hesitated, their spoons hovering, then began to eat in silence, the only sound the soft scrape of cutlery against tin. For some, tears slid silently down their cheeks, unbidden, as the warmth of the food filled their empty stomachs. One woman, her voice barely audible, whispered, "My brothers starved in the snow, and here they feed us like this." It was not the kindness they had been promised by their leaders, who had warned of humiliation and suffering. Yet the humiliation never came. There were no taunts, no jeering, no cruelty. The guards paced slowly up and down the aisles, their eyes scanning with professional detachment, their presence steady but not threatening. One young soldier, hardly older than the women themselves, offered a crooked smile as he passed, a small gesture that felt like reassurance, however fleeting. The prisoners were unprepared for such contradictions, having steeled themselves for brutality only to encounter this quiet civility, a kindness that was somehow more unsettling than any punishment they had imagined. In the days that followed, life in the camp revealed further shocks, each one chipping away at the foundations of their beliefs. Each morning, a bell rang out, sharp and clear, summoning them to breakfast and assigning them light duties. Some worked in bustling camp kitchens, chopping vegetables or stirring pots, the steam rising in clouds around them. Others were sent to nearby fields, harvesting crops under the watchful eyes of guards, their hands sinking into the rich, dark soil. Some toiled in laundries, scrubbing and pressing American uniforms, the scent of soap and starch a constant reminder of their new reality. They were paid small wages in camp scrip, a form of currency that could be spent at a canteen within the camp. There, on simple wooden shelves, lay miracles of abundance. Bars of chocolate wrapped in shiny foil, packs of cigarettes, pencils with sharp tips, even tubes of lipstick in shades of red and pink. The women stood before these goods as though at a sacred altar, their eyes wide with disbelief. A single chocolate bar was a marvel, a luxury they hadn't known in years. A tube of lipstick was unthinkable, a relic of a world they had left behind. Yet here, the enemy offered these treasures in exchange for their labor, a transaction that felt almost cruel in its irony. Back in Germany, their families scavenged for scraps among the rubble, their cities reduced to ashes, their children picking through debris for crusts of bread. Letters from home, when they arrived through the censors, were filled with despair, their words etched in shaky handwriting. One woman, her voice trembling, read aloud by the flickering light of a candle. "We live in the cellar now, the house above destroyed. We boil weeds for soup. If you have anything, please send it." She folded the letter carefully, her fingers shaking, knowing she could send nothing but words across the vast ocean. The gulf between their suffering homeland and the strange, almost surreal abundance of the camp widened with each passing day, a chasm that weighed heavily on their hearts. Some women began to feel a shame heavier than any chains, a guilt that gnawed at their souls. They were enemies of this land, yet here they were fed, clothed, and sheltered in ways their own nation had failed to provide. Germany had demanded their loyalty, sent them to operate radios or man searchlights under the threat of bombs, but rewarded them with hunger, ruins, and despair. America, the sworn enemy they had been taught to hate, offered them soap, hearty stew, and a semblance of dignity. This inversion of everything they had known ate at their spirits, an unspoken truth that lingered in the quiet moments. At night, they lay awake in their bunks, listening to the soft chirping of crickets outside the barracks, a sound so foreign to the thunder of artillery they had grown accustomed to. They wondered what it all meant, what this strange new world was trying to tell them about their past, their present, and the uncertain future that loomed ahead. Not all adjusted easily to this bewildering reality. A few resisted, refusing to eat the food offered to them, hoarding crusts of bread beneath their pillows, convinced that the generosity was a deception, a prelude to some hidden cruelty. Rumors circulated in hushed tones through the bunks at night. What if the food is drugged? What if the soap contains some secret poison? Yet day after day, nothing happened except the relentless normalcy of camp life. Their bodies grew stronger, their skin cleared of the grime and infections that had plagued them, and the lice that had tormented them vanished. Slowly, reluctantly, suspicion gave way to a cautious acceptance, though it came with its own kind of pain. The Americans, too, watched with curiosity, their own perceptions shifting. Many of the guards had never seen German women before, knowing them only through the exaggerated caricatures of propaganda, villainous figures with cold eyes and iron wills. They were surprised to find instead young women, thin and exhausted, often frightened, some barely older than their own sisters back home. One guard, in a letter home, wrote with a mix of wonder and unease, "They're not what we were told. They're just girls, and they look at us like they're waiting for a blow that never comes." This observation, simple yet profound, marked the beginning of a deeper conflict, not one of guns or trenches, but of perception, as both captors and captives grappled with the humanity of the other. The women, for their part, were forced to reconcile the enemy they had been taught to fear with the reality unfolding before them. Each bite of warm, fresh bread, each bar of fragrant soap, each calm, neutral word from a guard chipped away at the image of the monstrous Americans they had been conditioned to believe in. The war had ended, but in their minds, a new battle had begun, a struggle between memory and reality, between the propaganda they had swallowed and the truth they now tasted. Anna captured this turmoil with painful clarity in her diary, her words a raw confession of the war within. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy. It's a fortress we can hide behind. But kindness, this unbearable kindness, is a force that dismantles everything we thought we knew. Her words echoed the silent thoughts of many, a shared reckoning that left them vulnerable. They no longer feared being broken by cruelty. They feared being undone by this unexpected humanity, this kindness that forced them to question not only their enemies but themselves. One evening, after a long day of labor in the fields, the women marched back to the camp as the sun dipped low, spilling golden light across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. The air carried the fresh scent of cut grass, unmarred by the smoke of burning cities, a stark contrast to the charred landscapes they had left behind. The scene was simple, almost mundane, yet it weighed on them more heavily than the ruins of their homeland. Here was a land untouched by war, abundant with life, pulsing with a vitality that seemed to mock the devastation they had known. Germany was rubble, its streets choked with debris, its people starving. America stood unscathed, prosperous, and alive, its very existence a rebuke to the promises of the Reich. This truth planted a new unease in their hearts, a seed of doubt that grew with each passing day. They had survived the initial shock of captivity, the soap, the showers, the food, but now something more profound and more difficult was dawning. the realization that the enemy might be far more human and far more powerful than they had ever been led to believe. The weeks settled into a steady rhythm, a predictable cycle of morning bells, breakfast lines, work details, suppers, and lights out. Yet beneath this surface of routine, something deeper stirred, a quiet transformation that crept into their thoughts. At first, they had counted the days like prisoners carving tallies into stone walls, each mark a reminder of their captivity. But gradually, the sharp edges of that confinement dulled, replaced by a quiet bewilderment that was both unsettling and profound. They were captives, yes, but they were also fed, clothed, and even paid for their labor, a stark contrast to the collapsing Reich, where loyalty had been rewarded with hunger and ruin. This inversion gnawed at their minds more persistently than any barbed wire fence could, challenging the very foundations of their beliefs. Anna, who had once sat in a Munich office typing orders she never questioned, now worked in the camp laundry, her hands immersed in warm, soapy water as she scrubbed American uniforms. The scent of starch and soap clung to her fingers, a constant reminder of the strange new reality she inhabited. Each shirt bore the initials of men who were her sworn enemies, yet as she folded them into neat piles, she felt less hatred than a peculiar, guilty relief. This work was not war. It was not the chaos of retreat or the terror of air raids. It was work that kept her alive, that gave her a purpose, however small. Sometimes, catching her reflection in the polished steel of the washing drums, she paused, staring at the woman looking back at her, wondering who she was becoming in this strange new world. Other women were assigned to the fields, working under the watchful eyes of guards, harvesting crops that fed both prisoners and soldiers alike. They felt the sun warming their backs, the rich earth crumbling under their nails, and the surprising weight of baskets filled with fresh produce. Some, in rare moments, laughed softly at their own sweat, the labor-stirring memories of rural villages left behind, of simpler times before the war had torn their lives apart. In the evenings, they returned to the camp, their muscles aching but their spirits strangely lighter, as if the act of working the land had grounded them in a way they hadn't expected. This was not the degradation they had braced themselves for, not the punishment they had been warned about. It was something else entirely, something that defied the narratives of shame and suffering they had carried with them. The camp canteen became the most bewildering corner of their new world, a place where the small slips of camp scrip they earned could be exchanged for treasures unimaginable in their war-ravaged homeland. Wooden shelves held chocolate bars wrapped in gleaming foil, cigarettes in neat packs, jars of sweet, sticky jam, and even small luxuries like pencils and lipstick. The first time Anna bit into a Hershey bar, the rich, velvety sweetness exploded on her tongue, a sensation so vivid it transported her back to childhood, to a time before hunger and fear had defined her days. Tears pricked her eyes, and she turned away from the others, ashamed of the joy that surged through her. A girl from Bremen, her hands trembling, applied a swipe of lipstick, staring at her reflection in a small, cracked mirror with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I feel human again," she murmured, her voice soft, as though confessing a sin. But this abundance carried its own torment, a sharp reminder of the suffering back home. Letters continued to arrive, smuggled past censors, their words heavy with desperation. Families wrote of bombed-out apartments, of children coughing in damp cellars, of bread lines stretching into the freezing dawn. One woman, her voice breaking, read her mother's plea aloud. "If only we had your American bread. Your brother starves." Silence fell, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the faint scratching of rats beneath the barracks floorboards. The women sat clutching their letters, their trays of food untouched, the shame of plenty burning in their throats like bile. The Americans noticed these contradictions, too, their own perspectives shifting as they observed their unlikely prisoners. Some guards were astonished to see the German women gaining weight, their cheeks filling out, their hair regaining its shine, their bodies slowly shedding the marks of war's deprivation. "They're better fed than folks back home in some towns," one soldier muttered, his tone a mix of resentment and reluctant wonder. Yet rules were rules, and under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to standards of care that often surpassed those in war-torn Europe. The irony was not lost on anyone, neither the captors nor the captives. Still, suspicion lingered among the women, a stubborn remnant of their conditioning. At night, whispers crept through the bunks. What if this is all a facade? What if tomorrow the masks fall away and the cruelty begins? A handful clung to their distrust, hoarding crusts of bread under mattresses, convinced that the generosity was a trap, a prelude to some unseen punishment. Yet, as weeks turned into months, even the most cautious were worn down by the relentless normalcy of American order. No beatings came, no punishments beyond the dull monotony of work. The greatest cruelty, it seemed, was to be treated with decency, a kindness that cut deeper than any blow. Anna's diary became a painful record of this inner conflict, her words a mirror to the turmoil shared by many. I eat and my stomach thanks me. I sleep and my body grows strong. Yet each kindness cuts me deeper. How do I reconcile this with the faces of children in Munich who drink water for supper? Her writing gave shape to the invisible war now raging in their hearts. A battle not of physical survival but of meaning, of identity, of truth. To be brutalized would have been simpler, a confirmation of the enemy they had been taught to hate. To be treated with dignity by that same enemy was unbearable, a challenge to everything they had believed. Small encounters with the Americans deepened these contradictions, each moment a thread unraveling the tapestry of their former certainties. One evening, during a routine roll call under the fading light, a young guard dropped his flashlight, the metal clattering against the ground. Anna, acting on instinct, stooped to pick it up, handing it back to him. Their fingers brushed briefly, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. He gave a quiet nod, a gesture so small yet so human that it lingered in her mind for days, a quiet question mark against the hatred she had been taught. Another time, a soldier passing by the laundry hummed a soft, rhythmic tune, unmistakably American, its melody light and carefree. A girl from Cologne recognized it, her face breaking into a surprised laugh as she began to hum along, her voice tentative but clear. For a brief, fragile second, two enemies shared a song, a moment of connection across a gulf that the war had declared unbridgeable. Not all guards were kind. Some looked at the women with open disdain, their eyes sharp with the grief of brothers lost in the muddy fields of Europe. Yet even their hostility rarely spilled into action, restrained by the rules of the camp and the broader code that governed it. The women were not free, but neither were they brutalized. They existed in a liminal state, suspended between punishment and reprieve, a restless unease settling over them like dust. Then came the days when they were taken outside the wire for work details in nearby American towns, a new chapter that brought its own revelations. They rode in trucks through streets that seemed to belong to another world, their eyes wide with wonder and disbelief at shop windows brimming with goods, colorful fabrics, canned foods, toys, untouched by the scarcity of war. Children chased hoops down sidewalks, their laughter ringing out, while men sat on porches, reading newspapers under the shade of unbombed roofs. The women smelled the warm, sugary scent of bakeries, saw rows of shiny cars gleaming in the sunlight, and caught glimpses of movie posters plastered on brick walls, advertising films in vibrant colors. To women whose last memories of Germany were cratered streets, charred buildings, and the wail of air raid sirens, this vision of normalcy was overwhelming, almost unbearable. America was not merely intact, it was flourishing, its vitality a stark contrast to the desolation they had left behind. That night, back in the barracks, the air buzzed with whispered conversations, the women's voices a mix of awe and anguish. Did you see the cars? The bread, it was white, soft, fresh. The houses, untouched by bombs. For some, the shock of America's abundance was intoxicating, a glimpse of a life they had almost forgotten was possible. For others, it was unbearable proof of Germany's collapse, a bitter confirmation that the Reich's promises of empire had crumbled into dust, while the enemy they had been taught to hate had built a world of plenty. The conflict, once fought with guns and bombs, now turned inward, a silent battle of loyalty against reality, pride against gratitude, hatred against a reluctant, creeping admiration. Each bite of chocolate, each hot shower, each glimpse of an unbroken American street chipped away at the fortress of propaganda they had once held dear. The women began to realize that the Reich had not only lied to them, it had stolen their vision of the world, replacing it with a narrative of fear and superiority that now lay in tatters. As the crickets sang outside the wire and the camp lights glowed like pale moons in the night sky, Anna lay awake, her eyes tracing the rafters above her bunk. She thought of her family in Munich, her mother boiling weeds for supper in a cellar that had once been a home, the rubble where her office had stood, its typewriters silenced forever. She thought, too, of the American guard's quiet nod, the taste of chocolate melting on her tongue, the sensation of clean water streaming down her back in the shower. Between these images stretched an abyss, a vast and unbridgeable divide she could not yet cross. But in her heart, she knew something within her was shifting, something irreversible, a crack in the foundation of who she had been. As another dawn broke over the camp, gilding the barbed wire in a soft, golden light, the women understood that survival was no longer their only challenge. The true struggle lay in confronting what their captivity revealed, not just about the enemy, but about their homeland, their beliefs, and, most profoundly, themselves. Autumn leaves drifted across the camp yard, crisp and golden in the cool breeze, their delicate rustle a reminder of time's relentless march. Inside the wire, time itself felt fluid, its passage marked less by calendars than by the rhythm of meals, work, and the rare, precious letters from home that arrived like faint echoes of a lost world. Beneath the surface of this routine, something profound had taken root, a quiet transformation that grew with each passing day. For months, they had lived with the shock of America's unexpected gifts, soap, bread, kindness, and now they faced a harder reckoning. What did all of this mean for who they had been, and who they might become in this strange, disorienting place? Anna sat on the barak steps one evening, her diary balanced on her knees, the fading light casting long shadows across the page. She wrote with a clarity that felt almost painful, her words sharper than ever before, as if she could no longer contain the storm of thoughts churning within her. I have eaten more in this captivity than in all the winters of the Reich, when hunger was our constant companion. I have slept without the fear of bombs raining down, without the scream of sirens tearing through the night. Yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is this, where the enemy we were taught to despise shows us more dignity than our own leaders ever did? Her handwriting trembled, the pen shaking in her hand as she paused, her breath catching. In the distance, she heard laughter from a group of women gathered nearby, their voices bright as they traded pieces of candy and teased one another about the shades of lipstick they had bought with their scrip. Their levity, their ability to find joy in such small things, felt like a foreign language to Anna. She envied their lightness, their ability to let go of the weight of their broken homeland, but she could not join them. Her loyalty to Germany, to the memories of her family and the life she had known, held her fast, even as it slipped through her fingers like sand. The Americans, for their part, grew accustomed to their unlikely prisoners, their initial wariness giving way to a cautious familiarity. Some guards stopped seeing the women as symbols of an enemy regime and began to recognize them as individuals, frail, stubborn, bewildered by their circumstances, and sometimes even charming in their halting attempts to speak English. A few guards shared cigarettes, passing them silently across the wire in gestures that were more human than political, small acts of connection that transcended the labels of captor and captive. But for every moment of quiet kindness, there remained an unspoken distance, a reminder that these women were still the enemy, still prisoners, still tied to a war that had claimed countless lives. The camp was never entirely free of tension, its atmosphere softened only by the predictable rhythm of routine, a fragile balance that held the contradictions at bay. Outside the wire, however, the greatest revelations awaited, each outing a window into a world that challenged everything the women had known. More frequently now, they were sent into nearby American towns for labor, escorted by guards but granted a degree of freedom that felt almost surreal. They picked cotton in sun-drenched fields, worked in canneries where the air was thick with the scent of preserved fruit, or tidied municipal parks, their hands sweeping leaves into neat piles. Townsfolk watched them with a mix of curiosity and caution. Some gazes were cold, others warm, many simply indifferent. Children gawked openly, pointing at the German girls with wide-eyed wonder, while shopkeepers peered from doorways, their expressions unreadable. Yet what struck the women most was not the reactions of the people, but the sheer normalcy of the world around them. American life flowed on, unbroken by the scars of war. Cinemas lit up their marquees with glowing signs, announcing the latest films. Grocery stores displayed shelves overflowing with goods, cans of soup, jars of jam, fresh produce piled high. Radios blared jazz tunes and baseball scores, their cheerful notes filling the air with a carefree energy that felt alien to women whose last memories of Germany were of cratered streets, charred ruins, and the constant threat of death. One day, after hours of harvesting crops under a blazing sun, Anna's group was ushered into a church hall by local volunteers for a lunch that felt like a feast. The tables groaned under the weight of sandwiches stacked high with meat and cheese, bowls of fresh fruit gleaming in the light, and pies with golden crusts that gave off the warm, sweet scent of apples and cinnamon. The women hesitated, their hands hovering over the food as if afraid it might vanish, a mirage born of their hunger. An elderly American woman, her apron dusted with flour, urged them gently, "Eat, eat," her voice soft but insistent. Anna picked up an apple, its skin red and glossy, and bit into it. The crisp, sweet flavor burst in her mouth, a sensation so vivid it brought tears to her eyes. She hadn't tasted fruit since 1942, when scarcity had stripped such luxuries from their lives. Across the table, another prisoner whispered, her voice barely audible, "This is paradise." But Anna could only stare at the apple's white flesh, her mother's voice echoing in her memory. Save the peel for soup. The contrast, the abundance here, the desperation back home, threatened to break her, a fault line running through her heart. At night, back in the barracks, the conversations grew heavier, the women's voices weighted with the burden of their thoughts. They spoke of home, of families surviving in cellars, of children barefoot in the snow, their toes blue with cold, of brothers lost to the frozen trenches of the Eastern Front. Some began to voice the unspeakable, their words tentative, as if testing the air for judgment. Perhaps our nation lied to us. Perhaps we were sacrificed not for glory, but for destruction. One woman, her eyes fixed on the folds of her blanket, murmured, "We were taught they were beasts, these Americans. But who are the beasts now? Those who bombed our homes into rubble, or those who built this world of plenty?" No one answered, the silence heavier than any words could be. It carried the weight of guilt, of doubt, of a truth too painful to fully embrace. Gratitude, too, became a burden, an emotion as unsettling as shame. They were prisoners, yet they were alive, clean, and fed, their bodies growing stronger with each passing day. They had expected to be stripped of dignity, to be humiliated and broken. Instead, they were given more than they had dared to imagine. Soap that smelled of flowers, showers that washed away the grime of war, chocolate that melted on their tongues like a forgotten dream. These were not just provisions, they were tokens of something larger, something harder to name. Was it mercy? Was it hypocrisy? Or was it simply that the Americans lived by rules the Reich had long abandoned, rules that valued human dignity even for enemies? Each woman wrestled with these questions in the quiet of her own mind, unable to resolve them, yet unable to turn away from the truths they revealed. Anna's diary grew into a confession of this inner turmoil, its pages a sanctuary for the thoughts she could not speak aloud. It would be easier to hate. Hatred is a fortress, a wall that keeps the world at bay. But what they give us, bread, soap, music, it slips past those walls, demanding that we see them as human. And if they are human, what becomes of all the blood, all the ruins, all the lies we swallowed whole? She closed the book one evening, her chest tight with something akin to betrayal, not of her country, but of the version of herself that had believed in its promises. The guards, too, sensed this shift, their own perspectives evolving as they watched their prisoners. They saw the women laugh at American films shown in makeshift camp cinemas, their voices rising in clumsy but earnest harmony as they sang along to radio tunes. One sergeant, his voice low, remarked to another, "You'd forget for a minute they were the enemy if you didn't look at the uniforms." His words carried both wonder and a subtle warning, a reminder that war had demanded clear lines, friend or foe, ally or enemy. But life, in its messy complexity, blurred them. The greatest shock, however, came not from the food, the work, or the glimpses of American streets, but from the mirror. The women's bodies changed, their transformations a silent testament to the care they received. Their faces filled out, losing the gaunt sharpness of starvation. Their hair, once dull and matted, regained its luster, catching the light in soft waves. Color returned to their cheeks, and some even looked younger, as though captivity had peeled away the years of war's relentless toll. To see themselves restored in this way was almost unbearable, a mirror held up to the failures of their own nation. The enemy had made them healthy, their skin clear, their bodies strong. Their own country had let them starve, their cities crumbling under the weight of misguided promises. This was not just a revelation, it was an indictment, a truth that cut deeper than any blade. Yet, even as they adjusted, as laughter returned in tentative bursts and their bodies grew accustomed to the rhythm of camp life, an unease hung over everything like a shadow. They knew captivity could not last forever. One day, they would be sent back to Germany, to the rubble of their cities, to families waiting in despair, their lives defined by hunger and loss. The thought of leaving this abundance for scarcity, of trading soap for soot, filled them with a quiet dread. More than one woman whispered in the darkness of the barracks, "I am afraid to go back." The words felt treasonous, a betrayal of their homeland. Yet they were true, heavy with the weight of a reality they could not escape. As winter approached, rumors of impending transfers and repatriation began to spread, their whispers filling the barracks with a restless unease. What awaited them in the ruins of their homeland? Would their families even recognize them? Their cheeks flushed with the health of captivity, their bodies strengthened by the enemy's care? Some dreaded the judgment they might find in their mother's eyes, the silent accusation that they had lived well while others starved. Anna, staring once more at her diary, penned words she had never dared to write before, her hand shaking with the weight of her confession. "I fear leaving this place more than I feared arriving." The admission chilled her to the bone, but it was honest, a truth she could no longer deny. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been guns or bombs, nor even the propaganda that had shaped their fears. It had been soap, food, and dignity, simple acts that had done what hatred could not. They had changed her, reshaped her understanding of the world and her place in it. One morning, as frost laced the camp fences in delicate patterns, the announcement came, sharp and final. A transport would depart soon, carrying them back across the ocean. The women crowded together, their hearts pounding, their eyes wide with questions they could not bring themselves to voice. To return meant facing hunger, ruins, and the ghosts of all they had once believed in. To stay meant captivity, but also life, a life that had unexpectedly restored them. The guards read the names from a list, their voices flat and unemotional, but to the women, each syllable landed like a thunderclap, shaking the fragile world they had built within these walls. As Anna heard her name called, she stepped forward into the cold morning light, her breath visible in the crisp air. In that moment, she realized the true conflict was no longer between nations, between armies clashing on bloodied fields. It was inside her, in the space where hatred had once burned, fierce and certain, and where something new had begun to take root, something fragile, dangerous, and undeniably real. This new thing was not yet fully formed, but it carried the weight of questions she could not yet answer. Who was the enemy, truly? What did it mean to be human in a world that had tried so hard to strip that humanity away? And what would it mean to return to a homeland that had betrayed them, to face a future shaped by the lessons of the strange, transformative captivity? As the buses rolled out through the gates, the barbed wire glinting in the early light, Anna and the others carried these questions with them, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that the journey ahead would demand not just survival, but a reckoning with everything they had come to understand.